Welcome to the Developing DEI Partners and Allies Through Inclusion session. This is a 30-minute session designed to help participants better understand some of the nuances that can occur when moving through this work and techniques and skills that can be used during these times. I'll be honest, at times it's not easy. DEI conversations can challenge even those that are the most well-versed in this area. Casual, serious, and professional conversations addressing DEI work has the ability to cut to the core of both professional and personal thoughts on subject matters, which not everyone in the room will agree on. And at times, thoughts can end up being opposing when initially the meeting was called because everyone was on the same page to move forward in this DEI journey. But contrary to how people may be feeling during these times, it's not bad when moments like these happen because it means that people are sharing honest perspectives that are allowing others to see standpoints from which they are coming from. This can lead to very healthy and productive conversations which move the work forward. However, at times these conversations can also make people feel further apart at the end of the meeting instead of closer. This session is designed around how myself and many of my colleagues have worked with our own selves and with other people to help them navigate through conversations of DEI for positive understanding and improved outcomes, such that partners and allies can be developed through the frames of using inclusion during these conversations. And in doing so, progress can still feel like it was achieved in bringing the group closer to understanding on shared goals and moving forward with the DEI work, even though there still may be differences with how people think. Much of what I will be working through with you today is based around my own experiences, both personal and professional, and as many of those who have been focusing on DEI work know, personal and professional have moments where they will converge. Specifically in the nonprofit sectors that I have and currently work in, DEI work has challenged me to my core, as my own personal belief systems had to be examined to better understand why professional decisions were being made. And my own personal belief systems had to be examined when I would have meetings with people who were completely on the opposite side of the conversation that we were talking about, and yet we still had to learn and be able to work together on some of the most challenging things where it required for us to be able to understand and move forward for the greater good of the work that we were doing and the clients that we were serving. And many of the times in this work, it is actually normal to be able to experience this. That's part of community development, is to be able to work with many people, have many various ideas and thoughts about things that have to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion when we're looking at building and bridging communities together. What's also normal in this work, in what is also required when working in DEI, because we have to do the self-examination to know the standpoints in which we're coming from, is also accepting the fact that we have subconscious and indirect biases that we are sometimes not even aware of in our own selves that can cause the hitch points or the stall points in progress when it comes to bringing about partners and allies in this work. And that will be something that I talk about later in the session as one of the main areas of importance on how to improve yourself and become a leader in this work through how you are in relationship to others that you're working with, as they are trying to develop allies and partners too as well. So specifically to the background of where I'll be coming from for over the next 20 minutes, the major lived and learned experiences that have informed and my guide and have guided my work in the DEI space are as follows. I am an immigrant Asian to the United States who grew up in a rural, non-ethnically diverse town. A majority of the town was Caucasian, and a multi-generational families were actually a majority of those that I know and grew up with still live in that town today. I have my degree in both comparative religion and sociology in community and economic development, which has allowed me to look at social systems and belief systems and religious systems and how they work within societies from a very unbiased perspective without having to decide whether or not the beliefs or the thoughts or the perspectives were wrong or right, but rather examining it from a logic standpoint of how these beliefs and thoughts were crafted and how they were brought about into people through the events and through the teachings that they learned from those around them. And then finally, by working in the nonprofit sector in food insecurity and youth development in heavily diverse multicultural communities of the San Francisco Bay Area, to rural areas that were highly stratified socioeconomically as well as culturally between two major ethnic groups that resided in the community. And this was both in the Midwest as well as in rural areas of California. So through these experiences, both learned and lived, many of the conversations that I've had with people, both people that I'm colleagues with, staff that I have managed, supervisors that I have worked for, from all different levels and from all different angles, the more and more that I got comfortable in this space to be able to have open and honest conversations and creating safe places in order for the conversations to happen, I started to notice that people started bringing to me things that they were afraid to talk about with others, but were really bothering them on the inside because they needed to find a way to resolve them. Many of them were good people that were successful and professionals in their own right, that were trying to move forward in the DEI space. But as many of you know that have gone through this before, we'll all go through things at times that will challenge us. And so some of these conversations centered around three of these that I'm bringing to you today in order to help us work through this platform of developing partners and allies through inclusion. So reading through these, one of the conversations that I've had is, I know I can never truly understand how difficult it must be based on what they have shared with me because I'm different. But I've had my own experiences that are similar and know how difficult the world can be. So I want to help, but when I try, they make me feel the same way others have made me feel in the past. I don't belong. Another conversation that I've had with somebody that was struggling through some of this work, I don't understand why it's okay for groups of people who have been marginalized to come together in work environments and then make other feel marginalized with how they work together. And then finally on this slide, but definitely not the last conversation that I've had. So many more center around thematically the things that I've presented to you, as well as other areas of conversation that are even more intense than some of the ones that I'm bringing to you today. I wanted to help, but because I was different than the group, they said I couldn't understand and wouldn't let me help. So, through these experiences that I've highlighted, conversations in which people have come to speak with me about after having experienced frustrations in their work or in their volunteer work. The interesting part is that when I've spoken with these people about the conversations that I had with colleagues or staff members on my team, there was an immediate assumption by others that it was a member of a minority ethnic community regarding a group of Caucasian people. However, as I continue to explain to them about these conversations that I've had, they became very surprised to learn when I let them know that that was not the case. The first conversation was actually an African American man talking about his experience with a diverse group of women. The second conversation that I've showed to you was actually of a lesbian Caucasian woman talking about her work with Hispanics, and a majority of them were immigrants to this country. And lastly, the person that was speaking to me about this was a group of men who were talking to me about Asian coworkers. And so, what I really started to understand as I started to move through these conversations is that a lot of the times the assumptions that we make have to do with the standard power structures and the standard things that we hear about on an everyday basis about marginalized groups. But what I started to think about when it came to marginalization and how we work together in this DEI space is that marginalization really doesn't have anything to do with ethnicity, culture. It cuts across that. The more and more of these conversations that I continued to have over the years, I began to realize that even with the best of people who had the best of intent that were trying to help, it was boiling down to people feeling marginalized during these moments of trying to work together. As you can tell by the definitions and the examples that I give above, the marginalization of a person in its purest definition doesn't know the bounds of ethnicity, culture, race, gender, sexual preference, political views, socioeconomic status, you name it. It doesn't know the bounds of those. It's much like the work that I do in hunger. Everyone, regardless of how they identify themselves, feeling insignificant or being made to feel powerless by the group that is in control is what can be at the crux of DEI conversations and work gone wrong during these conversations. Inclusivity when developing partners has to include room for people to be able to identify when others are being made to feel marginalized or irrelevant to the conversation. Then working through these using strong and honest communication so as not to lose partners in this work, but rather to continue to develop and strengthen them. By respecting the standpoint that all people around the table are expressing their own thoughts, whether you agree or disagree, knowing how to identify when people are feeling marginalized or powerless in the inability to contribute to the conversation or contribute to the solution is the start to developing partners and allies in this work. Further, one of the other main ways that helps me with developing partners and allies in this work is knowing that understanding doesn't necessarily mean agreement. Not agreeing is okay. Agreement within conversations when discussing DEI doesn't happen all the time. With the various backgrounds, personal and religious beliefs, cultural norms and values, learned and lived experiences that people are bringing to the table, and how they think about diversity, inclusion, and equity will always vary naturally. However, to know that there are other ways of understanding that don't require agreement can be game changers in developing partners and allies while still allowing everyone to contribute to the conversation and feel heard and welcomed, as opposed to marginalized and powerless to help. As opposed to agreement, we can find sympathy, empathy, and compassion within these conversations, and there are always good perspectives to have, in addition to agreement, in order to make sure that we can keep the DEI work moving forward. And finally, one of the most important things to have in this DEI journey is honesty with oneself. I have found through my years of work that this is one of the key things that I always have to look to. And I always have to remember before walking into a conversation where I know diversity, equity, and inclusion concepts will be discussed. There was a time a few years ago when I was struggling in this space, actually. The more dichotomized communities were becoming, the political landscape was changing, hate crimes were on the rise, and I was finding myself wondering why I was starting to struggle with conversations around DEI when they had been so fluid for me in the past. So even with having a lot of experience in this work, we can find ourselves in times through our own personal journeys falling in and out of this space because of how we think or what we're seeing or how it's affecting us because of our personal and because of our lived and learned experiences. But until I met a mentor whom I've trusted for many years, they reminded me of what I've shared with you already, and also that self-awareness was one of the most fundamental and necessary things to bring to the table with you when working with and developing allies on this journey to inclusion and equity. Instead of wondering why others were causing conversations to take a turn for the worse, like I was doing, being the leader that sets an example for others to participate and create a safe place to have conversations was important. It was setting a solid example through your own actions on how to move and work through this work. So first, self-learning and self-examination. Earlier, I had mentioned subconsciousness or subconscious bias. In order for me to better understand and having discussions with people in the space, it was necessary to acknowledge to myself that I have my own personal biases as well. Then to be able to call out what those biases could be or are through self-examination and better understanding one's own self. It helped me and it can help people prepare to know what the biases are that are affecting their ability to continue conversations with others and not negatively affect the outcomes or impact the flow of conversations. So, in other words, looking at yourself in these DEI conversations while we're trying to develop partners and allies, is it really you that are the one that are bringing your own personal biases into the mix that could be causing or stalling conversations from happening? To be able to know and understand where those trigger points are for you are so very important prior to going into these meetings. And it's not to say that they're wrong or they're right, because learned and lived experiences create who we are as people. However, it's important to know what those biases may be, because we're always looking to continually improve ourselves too as well. And while we may not be able to take care of subconscious or unintentional biases at the time, at least we're aware enough to know where they have the ability to stall conversations. And in those cases, you become a leader in being able to call those out during the times those meetings are happening, to allow other people to maybe look inside themselves too as well for where their own self biases may be stalling the conversations also. But it always has to start with you first. Then from there, the other ways that create strong communications: active listening, of course, thoughtfulness with how we speak and use words, patience through the conversations as people are trying to figure out and move through these conversations that are probably challenging them to the core as well. Having compassion as people are moving through these conversations, because many of the times when we're having some really in-depth and intricate conversations where people are having to bring their lived and learned experiences to the table in order to be able to manage through the conversations, having compassion for them as they're going through sometimes what they're living again, as they're discussing and talking about it, having the compassion and patience to be able to allow them to work through that in a meeting setting or in a conversational setting is important. Clear and honest communication, absolutely. Many of the times in DEI conversations, it's the honesty that will really matter in order to be able to find progress through inclusion. And specifically to vulnerability, this is meant in the sense that you're acknowledging to those in the room during the conversation that you may be struggling at times. It may be difficult for you to talk about things, or it may be difficult for you to agree with another person because it's so opposite from what it is or how it is that you feel. But it's also allowing them the safe place, because if somebody has the ability to do it, then others may have the ability to do it as well, to be vulnerable and be able to state how they are feeling in the safe environment. And it's also acknowledging that you're not perfect and that you will make unintentional mistakes in this work. You may misspeak during a meeting. You may think thoughts that may be in opposition of what other people are thinking, but not necessarily intentionally. It could be unintentionally, but to acknowledge that you might be going through it yourself too as well allows other people to know that it's okay to be vulnerable in those moments. We cannot be perfect in the DEI space when we're having these conversations, because there's so many things that are going on and could possibly going on through the conversations. But having the ability to be able to state and say that you're struggling through a conversation and that you're trying to work through it and need support and help as you're working through it, even though people may not agree, can actually be a really great way to lead others to do the same, to come to the core of where the conversation is going and how you have the ability to move through that conversation to resolve whatever it is that you might be talking about. And then finally, looking for a trusted partner who understands this work to be a sounding board for you, so long as they can also be honest with you about where their thoughts are, about their thoughts, both positive and negative, about how your progress is happening through this DEI space. I have a few people that I regularly call before and after I have conversations that I know can be a little bit more difficult in this DEI space. And I counsel with them about the standpoints and the angles that I'm going to be taking it from, based on what I know, based on my learned and lived experiences, based on the training that I've had. to ask them what their honest feedback is and how other people may react to it, or if I'm using terminology that may not be, that may be unsettling for people in the room that I'm speaking with, and looking for other ways and ideas to be able to speak honestly about the conversation, but use thoughtfulness, a little bit more thoughtfulness with how I speak and use words in order to be able to bring people along on the journey. And that's not bring people along on the journey with me. That's bringing people along on a DEI journey that we're all talking about and working through together. Everyone in the room is responsible for creating a safe place for those around them. And it's through these techniques that I've just talked about that can allow that to happen. And many of the times it has worked for me. And so finally, using the philosophy of continual process improvement, it will be necessary for all walks of life and thoughts to be partners and allies in this work. We need to be able to make strides and progress, even with those that have the most opposing standpoints with regards to these conversations, need to be included so we can better understand how we can educate, teach, find understanding, look for compassion, be patient, and try to ensure that those that are willing to go on this journey with us as partners and allies don't feel marginalized through the process because of things that have happened unintentionally during DEI conversations and meetings that push them away. It's important for all of us to be able to learn how to work through the space so that we're not only thinking about ourselves, but we're thinking about how other people may be feeling, and how our own actions can cause other people to either feel included or not included. Hopefully, through some of the techniques that I've shared with you that I use on a regular basis through the groups that I work with, also help you when you're having your discussions and conversations about developing DEI partners and allies through inclusion. Thank you so much.